I was lying in a hospital bed, bleeding and bruised from a terrible car crash, when I heard my own daughter call me a troublesome old man. She and her husband left me alone in the emergency room, simply because they had a dinner party to attend. They thought I was just a helpless, clueless burden they could push aside. A week later, they came back to the hospital, demanding I sign over my $1.8 million home to them. But when they opened the door to my room, they did not find a weak old man. They found an empty bed, folded sheets, and a single envelope waiting for them. What was inside that envelope terrified them so much that my son-in-law actually fell to his knees in the hallway. Before I tell you exactly how I completely dismantled their lives and sent them packing, please do me a favor. If you have ever been betrayed by the people you sacrificed everything for, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what city or state you are watching from and what time it is right now. It gives me so much comfort to know I am not speaking into the void and that good people are listening out there. Now let me take you back to that cold room where my nightmare and their ultimate downfall began. The smell of medical alcohol and bleach is something you never quite forget. It settles in the back of your throat and coats your lungs. I woke up to the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. My chest felt like it had been crushed under a heavy concrete block, and a sharp, stinging pain radiated from my forehead where the emergency doctors had just put in stitches. I kept my eyes closed for a long time because the harsh, fluorescent lights of the hospital ceiling burned right through my thin eyelids. I am Victor Gallagher. I am 76 years old, and for 40 years I worked as a structural engineer in Seattle, Washington. I spent my entire life designing frameworks and building foundations that were meant to withstand earthquakes and last a lifetime. But lying there on that stiff, uncomfortable mattress, I realized the foundation of my own family was crumbling into absolute dust. My car had rolled into a deep drainage ditch off the highway just hours earlier after I lost control in the rain. I was incredibly lucky to be alive. As I slowly regained my senses, I expected to feel the warm, comforting hand of my daughter Natalie. I expected her to be sitting right beside me, holding my hand, just like my late wife Carolyn would have been. Instead, I heard voices outside the thin privacy curtain. They were hushed, but the hospital corridor was quiet enough that every single word carried directly over to my bed. It was Natalie. Her tone was sharp, irritated, and completely devoid of any affection. "We cannot stay here, Derek," she hissed to her husband. "The partners are expecting us at the restaurant in 30 minutes, and this dinner is crucial for your networking." I heard Derek sigh heavily, his shoes shifting on the linoleum floor. "I know, but what about your dad? The nurses said he needs to be monitored overnight." Natalie scoffed. It was a cruel, dismissive sound that drove an ice pick straight through my heart. "Oh, please. He is just a troublesome old man who should not be driving anyway. He only has some scratches and a mild concussion. Let the hospital staff handle him. They get paid to do this. I do not have the time to sit here holding his hand while he complains about his aches and pains. We are leaving." I held my breath, lying perfectly still. I prayed to a God I had not spoken to in years that Derek would tell her to stay, that he would remind her that I was her father, the man who gave her everything. Instead, I heard him agree without hesitation. "You are right. Let us go. I will text him tomorrow." The sharp clicking of Natalie's expensive designer heels echoed down the hallway, fading away until there was nothing left but the lonely beeping of my heart monitor. They actually left me. My only child abandoned me in an emergency room to go drink wine with strangers. I lay there in the dark, and the tears that fell from my eyes were not from the physical pain of the car crash. They were from a grief so deep and so heavy, it felt like I was suffocating under the weight of it. My mind instinctively drifted back 35 years. I remembered a bitterly cold November night in our old house. Natalie was just 7 years old, burning up with a terrifying fever from a severe case of pneumonia. Her tiny lungs were struggling for every single breath. I did not leave her side for 3 days and 3 nights. I slept in a rigid plastic chair right next to her hospital bed. I missed a massive project presentation at my engineering firm, a presentation that ended up costing me a major promotion to senior partner. I did not care. I would have burned my entire career to the ground just to see her fever break and see her smile again. Carolyn and I poured every ounce of our love, our life savings, and our daily energy into giving Natalie the perfect, privileged life. We paid off her expensive college tuition. We handed them a massive check when she and Derek first got married so they would not have to struggle like we did. I always thought that if you built a strong enough foundation of unconditional love, it would hold up under any storm. But my daughter had somehow grown into a cold, entitled stranger who looked at my bleeding body and saw nothing more than a schedule inconvenience. A young nurse finally peeked through the privacy curtain a few minutes later. Her eyes filled with gentle pity when she saw that I was awake, crying, and completely alone. She asked if I needed anything for the pain, or if there was anyone else she could call to come sit with me. I looked at the empty visitor chair in the corner of the room. I swallowed the thick lump in my throat, wiped the tears from my wrinkled face, and slowly shook my head. "No, thank you," I whispered, my voice rough and broken. "I am entirely alone." But as I stared back up at the blinding ceiling lights, the crushing sorrow in my chest began to harden. The tears stopped falling. The warm, forgiving father inside of me died on that hospital bed, and the cold, calculating engineer took his place. If they wanted to treat me like a troublesome old man, I was going to show them exactly how much trouble I could be. The morning light filtering through the hospital blinds was a pale, sickly gray. It perfectly matched the Seattle weather outside and the heavy mood settling deep into my bones. I discharged myself just after 8. The young doctor on duty advised against it, telling me I needed more rest and observation, but I simply nodded, signed the release papers, and asked the front desk to call me a ride. The physical stiffness had really set in overnight. Every step I took toward the sliding glass doors sent a sharp jolt up my spine, a lingering reminder of the violent impact when my car rolled off the highway. Physical pain was easy to manage. You take a pill, you grit your teeth, and push through it. The emotional betrayal I had witnessed the night before, however, was a completely different kind of wound. That was a wound that required a different kind of medicine. I climbed into the back seat of a black sedan that pulled up to the curb. The driver was a quiet man who simply confirmed my address and merged onto the wet morning roads. I stared out the rain-streaked window, watching the familiar streets of the city blur by. For decades, I had driven these exact routes, heading to construction sites and architecture firms building a life brick by brick. Now I was being chauffeured home to an empty house. My house. It is a beautiful, sprawling, craftsman-style home tucked away in the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood of Magnolia. I bought it back in 1982. Over the years, I poured my own sweat into remodeling it, ensuring every structural beam was sound and every room was perfect. Today, that property is completely paid off, without a single cent of debt attached to it, and valued at a solid $1.8 million. It was supposed to be our forever home, the place where my wife Carolyn and I would grow old together, surrounded by grandchildren. But cancer took Carolyn 5 years ago, and since then the house has felt more like a silent museum than a home. The spacious rooms echo with memories of her laughter, of the smell of her baking, and of the warmth she brought to every corner. Without her, it is just wood, glass, and stone. The car turned onto my street and slowly pulled up my long driveway, the tires crunching softly against the wet gravel. The driver put the car in park and waited. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my jacket, the same jacket I had been wearing during the crash, to pull out my wallet. The leather was slightly scuffed from the accident, but the zipper was fully intact. I unzipped it and slid my fingers into the familiar slots. I am a man of routine. As an engineer, my brain naturally categorizes and organizes everything I interact with. My driver license sits in the clear front window. My health insurance card is in the top slot on the right. My primary credit card, a blue Chase Sapphire, always rests in the second slot on the left. It has been that way for over 10 years. My fingers brushed the leather, but they met empty space. I paused. I opened the wallet fully and looked inside. The second slot was completely empty. I checked the other slots, thinking perhaps I had haphazardly shoved it somewhere else in a rush. Nothing. I checked my pants pockets, though I knew logically I never put loose cards there. It was gone. I told the driver to give me a moment, pulling out my phone to open the ride-sharing app. I switched my payment method to a backup debit card, thanked him, and stepped out into the damp morning air. I walked up the front steps, unlocking the heavy oak door. The silence of the house hit me instantly. I did not bother turning on the lights. I walked straight into the kitchen, a room Carolyn used to keep bright and full of life, and sat down heavily on one of the wooden bar stools at the center island. My mind was already shifting gears. The sorrow and self-pity from the hospital room were rapidly evaporating, replaced by the cold, calculating logic that had defined my entire professional career. When a bridge shows signs of stress, you do not sit down and cry over the cracked concrete. You inspect the damage, you trace the load paths, and you find the source of the failure. I placed my phone on the cool marble countertop and opened my banking application. My immediate thought was to freeze the missing credit card, assuming it had fallen out during the chaotic rescue at the crash site, and some opportunist had picked it up. The app loaded, displaying my recent account activity. I tapped on the Chase Sapphire account. My eyes locked onto the screen, and my breath caught in my throat. Right there at the very top of the transaction list was a pending charge. The amount was exactly $4,500. I stared at the numbers. 4,500. It was a perfectly round, flat number. Thieves who steal credit cards at accident scenes do not run up perfectly round numbers. They go to gas stations, they buy electronics, they purchase gift cards for odd amounts to test the limit. A flat $4,500 charge looked like a retainer fee, or a down payment, or a professional service invoice. But what sent a true chill down my spine was the timestamp next to the transaction. 11 at night. At 11 last night, I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, medicated, and completely unaware of my surroundings. The paramedics had handed all of my personal belongings, including my jacket and my wallet, to my next of kin when she arrived at the emergency room. I knew exactly what happened. The silence of the kitchen was broken by the sharp ringing of my cell phone on the marble counter. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen. It was Natalie. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs, and steadied my nerves. I needed to hear exactly what she was going to say. I pressed the green button and brought the phone to my ear. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was incredibly cheerful, dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone that felt completely unnatural. "I am so glad you answered. Derek and I were just so worried about you all night. We called the hospital this morning and the nurses told us you actually checked yourself out. Are you sure you should have done that? You know you are not as young as you used to be, and you really need your rest." I closed my eyes. The sheer audacity of her fake concern was physically nauseating. Just 10 hours ago, she had been standing on the other side of a thin hospital curtain, complaining that my bleeding head was an inconvenience to her dinner plans. But I did not yell. I did not scream or demand an apology. I kept my voice weak, gravelly, and tired. "I am fine, Natalie," I said slowly, letting out a heavy sigh. "I just wanted to sleep in my own bed. The hospital was too noisy, but I seemed to have misplaced something. I was looking through my wallet to pay the driver, and my blue credit card is missing. I also saw a very large charge pending on my account. Do you know anything about that?" There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. Just a fraction of a second, but enough for a trained engineer to notice the structural shift. When she spoke again, her voice was smooth, rehearsed, and completely confident. "Oh yes, Dad. I am so sorry, I meant to tell you about that right away. When you were brought into the emergency room, the police officers handed me your personal belongings. The hospital administration needed a mandatory deposit for your emergency care, and the towing company demanded immediate payment to pull your car out of the ditch and take it to the overnight storage lot. It came out to exactly $4,500. I used your card because Derek and I did not have that kind of cash on hand. I have your card right here in my purse. I will bring it by later this week when I come to visit. I see, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Thank you for handling that for me, sweetheart. I appreciate it. Of course, Dad. You just rest now. We love you. She hung up the phone. I lowered the device from my ear and set it gently back down on the counter. The lie was so smooth, so easily delivered, that it actually terrified me. She had not stuttered. She had not hesitated. She lied to her own father with the ease of a seasoned professional. But her lie was fundamentally flawed, built on a foundation of sheer ignorance and arrogance. First of all, I am 76 years old. I have comprehensive Medicare coverage plus a premium supplemental insurance plan that I have paid into for years. The hospital had my medical file on record. They would never demand an upfront cash deposit for emergency trauma care, especially not in the middle of the night. Secondly, towing companies operate on specific mileage rates, hookup fees, and daily storage taxes. A bill for pulling an SUV out of a ditch and storing it overnight would look something like $412.63. It would never under any circumstances be a perfectly flat, clean $4,500. I picked up my phone again, dialed the customer service number on the back of my backup debit card, and navigated the automated menus until I reached a human representative at the bank. I verified my identity, gave them my social security number, and asked the young man on the phone to look into the pending transaction. Yes, Mr. Gallagher, the representative said politely. I see the charge right here. It was manually keyed in at 11:14 last night. Can you please tell me the exact name of the merchant who processed that charge? I asked, my grip tightening on the edge of the kitchen island. Certainly, sir. The merchant name registered to that terminal is Apex Real Estate Legal Group. They are a law firm based downtown. Would you like me to dispute this charge for you? The kitchen seemed to grow colder. Apex Real Estate Legal Group. Why in the world would my daughter take my credit card while I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed and use it to pay a real estate attorney $4,500? It was a retainer fee. That much was obvious. But what kind of legal action requires a midnight transaction on a stolen credit card? They were not trying to help me. They were preparing to do something to my property, to my home. The $1.8 million asset I was currently sitting inside. No, I told the bank representative, my voice steady and resolute. Do not dispute the charge. Do not cancel the card. Leave the account exactly as it is. I authorized it. Are you sure, sir? I am absolutely sure. Thank you for your time. I ended the call. If I disputed the charge or canceled the card, I would immediately alert Natalie and Derek that I was onto them. They would change their tactics, hide their tracks, and come at me from a different angle. I needed them to believe that their plan was working flawlessly. I needed them to think that I was exactly what Natalie had called me, a very clueless, weak, troublesome old man. Over the next few days, I stayed inside my quiet house and laid the groundwork for my performance. An engineer knows that to test a structure, you must apply pressure to its weakest points. Natalie and Derek had a glaring weakness: their arrogance. They wanted to believe my mind was fading because it justified their actions and made their theft easier to execute. So I gave them exactly what they wanted. I stopped shaving, allowing patchy gray stubble to grow across my face. I wore mismatched socks and buttoned my cardigans unevenly so the fabric bunched at my waist. During our daily phone calls, I made sure my voice trembled slightly. Has Max been a good boy for you this morning? Mrs. Gable stopped in her tracks and looked up at me with an expression of genuine deep confusion. "Victor, his name is Buster," she said gently. "You know that, Victor, you have known him for years." I blinked rapidly, putting a shaking hand up to my forehead, acting entirely bewildered and lost. "Buster," I muttered quietly. "Yes, of course it is Buster. My deepest apologies, Mrs. Gable. My mind just feels so incredibly foggy lately." I looked down the steps at my daughter and my son-in-law. Natalie immediately exchanged a quick, knowing, silent glance with Derek. It was a dark, fleeting look of pure, predatory satisfaction. They fully believed the lie. They followed me slowly into the warm house, their demeanors shifting instantly the moment the heavy oak door closed behind us. They no longer treated me as a respected father, but rather as a confused patient who desperately needed to be managed and controlled. Derek casually leaned against my expensive marble kitchen counter, with his arms tightly crossed, an arrogant smirk playing on his thin lips. He looked around my pristine home with the cold eyes of a greedy man who already firmly believed he owned every single piece of furniture in the room. Watching him stand there, so confidently acting like the king of my castle, my mind instantly flashed back exactly 10 years. I vividly remembered a very different version of Derek. I remembered a young, terrified boy sitting nervously on my living room sofa, crying heavily into his trembling hands because he had secretly racked up $40,000 in credit card debt and could not afford to marry my daughter. He had desperately begged me for a financial rescue loan. He had sworn on his own life that he would always respect me, honor my family, and carefully take care of Natalie forever if I just helped him. I quietly paid off his massive debt the very next morning, because I wanted my only daughter to have a clean, fresh start. Now that exact same man was standing right in the kitchen I had painstakingly built, wearing an incredibly expensive tailored suit, silently calculating exactly how fast he could legally strip this entire house away from me. The sheer disrespect was a bitter, jagged pill to swallow, but I kept my wrinkled face perfectly blank and utterly devoid of any sharp intelligence. "Dad, you really do not look very well today," Natalie said, stepping forward and placing a condescending hand on my stooped shoulder. "Are you sure you are taking your prescribed medication?" I nodded slowly, purposely staring blankly at the beige wall behind her head. "I think so," I whispered softly. "But I cannot seem to find my house keys anywhere today. I have looked everywhere all morning, and they are just completely gone." I shuffled toward the large stainless steel refrigerator and pulled the heavy door open, staring aimlessly at the various organized shelves of cold food. "What in the world are you doing, old man?" Derek asked, his harsh voice dripping with thinly veiled contempt. "Your house keys are obviously not inside the refrigerator, Victor." I reached a shaking hand past a carton of milk and pulled out my heavy brass keyring, holding it up into the kitchen light with a violently trembling hand. "Oh my goodness! How did these ever get in here?" I whispered loudly, playing the part of a terrified, confused elder, losing his grip on reality. Natalie gasped, placing a manicured hand over her mouth, but her dark eyes were gleaming with financial triumph. "Oh, Dad," she cooed sweetly, wrapping her arms around my stiff shoulders in a fake, sickening embrace. "Your memory is getting so bad lately. You simply cannot continue to live like this all by yourself. You desperately need someone to step in and manage things for you." She truly thought she was winning the grand prize. She genuinely thought she had successfully manipulated a defenseless old man. But as she hugged me, I just stared over her designer shoulder, my eyes turning completely cold and lethally sharp. No, I was not broken at all. I was meticulously building a steel cage, and they had just willingly stepped inside and locked the door behind them. Natalie gently pulled away from our fake embrace and guided me toward the living room sofa. She spoke in that same sickly sweet tone, treating me like a fragile glass doll that might shatter at any given moment. "Dad," she murmured softly, stroking my arm. "Derek and I have been so worried about you since the accident. We actually arranged a special visit for you today. We reached out to a state medical representative who helps seniors get access to extra health benefits and in-home care. He is waiting just outside in the car right now. Before I could even pretend to protest or act confused, Derek was already walking briskly toward the front door. He opened it wide and gestured for a man to step inside. The man who walked into my house did not look like any medical professional I had ever seen in my 76 years of life. He was a tall, thin man wearing an inexpensive, poorly tailored gray suit. He carried a battered leather briefcase instead of a medical bag. There was no stethoscope around his neck, no badge indicating a hospital affiliation, and no compassionate bedside manner. He looked exactly like a low-level bureaucrat or a desperate notary public trying to make a quick buck on the side. My structural engineer brain immediately scanned him from head to toe, categorizing every single red flag. His shoes were scuffed, his tie was slightly crooked, and his eyes darted nervously around my expensive living room before finally settling on me. A real doctor carries an aura of quiet authority and genuine care. This man carried the unmistakable scent of a cheap scam. But I kept my face blank, letting my jaw hang slightly loose in artificial confusion. "Mr. Gallagher," the man said, stepping forward and extending a damp, clammy hand toward me. "My name is Dr. Evans. I am here on behalf of the Senior Wellness Division to conduct a routine evaluation. Your wonderful daughter here just wants to make sure you are getting all the state assistance you legally deserve." I slowly reached out and shook his hand with a weak, trembling grip. "Hello, Dr. Evans," I mumbled quietly, looking down at the floor. "I do not understand why I need an evaluation. I am just a little tired today, that is all." Dr. Evans smiled a thin, oily smile and sat down heavily in the armchair opposite my sofa. He unlatched his briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of papers and a silver pen. He did not pull out a blood pressure cuff or a thermometer. "Well, Victor," he began, using my first name with completely unearned familiarity. "Let us just go through some very simple questions, shall we? Can you tell me what day of the week it is today? And perhaps you can tell me the current year." He spoke incredibly slowly, over enunciating every single syllable. It was infuriating. He was talking to me as if I were a toddler trying to learn the alphabet. I squeezed my hands tightly together in my lap, digging my fingernails into my palms to keep myself from slapping the ridiculous clipboard right out of his hands. I looked over at Natalie, widening my eyes in feigned panic. "Tuesday," I said hesitantly, my voice shaking. "No, wait, maybe it is Wednesday. And the year is, well, it is 2020, I think." I intentionally gave him the wrong year, watching his reaction closely. Derek let out a loud, exaggerated sigh from the corner of the room, running a hand through his expensive hair. "See what we are dealing with here," Dr. Derek muttered loudly, shaking his head. "He does not even know what year it is. He is completely slipping away from us." Dr. Evans nodded sympathetically, making a dramatic show of writing a long note on his thick pad of paper. "That is perfectly all right, Victor," Dr. Evans said in a sickeningly soothing voice. "Memory lapses are incredibly common after a trauma. Let us try something a bit different. Can you tell me how you currently manage your household finances?" Victor, the fake doctor, asked, leaning forward with sudden, intense interest. "Do you pay your own bills every month? Do you know how much money is in your checking account right now?" The pivot was so incredibly clumsy and obvious that it almost made me laugh out loud. A state medical evaluator checking for senior benefits does not immediately interrogate a patient about their personal checking account balances. This was Derek and Natalie pulling the strings, using this fraud to build a documented case of my supposed incompetence. I slumped my shoulders forward, looking down at my slippers as if I were deeply ashamed and entirely defeated. "I do not know," I whispered pathetically. "Carolyn used to handle all of the checks. My wife, Carolyn. Since she passed away, I just leave the envelopes on the kitchen counter. Sometimes I forget to mail them. I think the bank takes care of it, but I am really not sure anymore. My head just feels so incredibly heavy lately, Doctor." Natalie immediately swooped in, sitting beside me, and rubbing my back with dramatic performative sorrow. "It is okay, Dad," she whispered softly, her eyes practically shining with greedy anticipation. "We are going to help you fix all of this today." Dr. Evans tapped his silver pen against his chin, looking at Derek with a slow, deliberate nod. "Well, based on this initial evaluation," he announced in a serious tone, "it is quite clear that Victor is suffering from significant cognitive decline. He is no longer capable of managing his own estate or his daily affairs without substantial risk to his well-being. Fortunately, I have the necessary state benefit forms right here." He smiled a very cold and utterly ruthless smile as he slowly pulled the legal paperwork directly from his battered old briefcase and placed it on the coffee table. The stack of papers landed on the glass surface of my coffee table with a heavy, definitive thud. It was a thick bundle, easily 20 or 30 pages bound together by a stiff black clip at the top margin. I stared down at the crisp white sheets, my breathing deliberately shallow, maintaining the facade of a terrified and confused old man. Dr. Evans slid the pile slightly closer to my knees, leaning back in his armchair, with the arrogant posture of a predator who firmly believes the trap has already snapped shut. "Here is what we are going to do, Victor," the fake doctor said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register. "These are standard state medical release forms and financial hardship applications. They will allow your daughter to legally coordinate with your primary care physician and the state health department on your behalf. It simply removes the stressful administrative burden from your shoulders, so you can focus entirely on your physical recovery." Natalie shifted closer to me on the sofa. I could smell her expensive floral perfume, a scent that suddenly made my stomach churn with intense disgust. She reached over and picked up the heavy silver pen Dr. Evans had left on the table. She uncapped it with a smooth, practiced motion and gently pressed the cool metal cylinder directly into my trembling right hand. Her fingers were warm, but her touch felt like ice against my skin. "Just sign on the yellow highlighted lines, Dad," she whispered softly, her voice practically vibrating with suppressed excitement. "It is just a few quick signatures. Derek and I will handle all the boring paperwork from here on out. You will never have to worry about missing another bill or dealing with confusing bank statements ever again. We are going to take such good care of you." Derek stepped out of the corner of the room and loomed over my left shoulder. He crossed his arms tightly, tapping his expensive leather shoe against the hardwood floor in a steady, impatient rhythm. The physical pressure in the room was immense. They were using a classic high-pressure sales tactic, surrounding the target, speaking in soothing but urgent tones, and trying to force a signature before the victim could process the actual contents of the contract. But they were not dealing with a gullible victim. They were dealing with a master structural engineer who had spent 40 years scrutinizing complex architectural blueprints and dense municipal building codes. My eyes were trained to find the hidden flaw, the tiny miscalculation that could bring a massive skyscraper crashing down into the street. I looked down at the top page. It did have a generic medical seal printed at the top, but the margins were completely wrong. The typography was inconsistent. I raised my right hand, letting it shake violently, so much so that the tip of the silver pen rattled against the glass coffee table. "Oh dear," I mumbled, my voice cracking perfectly. "I cannot seem to focus my eyes. The words are all blurring together. What exactly am I signing here, Natalie?" "It is just standard medical authorization, Dad," she insisted, her tone tightening ever so slightly, with rising frustration. "Please just put your name right there next to the yellow sticky note. The doctor is a busy man, and he needs to get to his next appointment." I clumsily dragged my elbow across the stack of papers, intentionally knocking the black clip off the top edge. The pages fanned out slightly across the table. "Oops, my goodness, I am so clumsy today," I whimpered, reaching out with both hands to nervously gather the scattered sheets. As I shuffled the papers back into a neat pile, my trained eyes rapidly scanned the exposed paragraphs underneath the fake medical cover sheet. I was reading the text upside down and sideways, catching crucial fragments of legal jargon hidden deep within the document. I saw the words fiduciary duty. I saw the phrase irrevocable transfer of assets. And then, as my thumb clumsily folded back the bottom corner of the very last page, I saw the true anchor of their sinister foundation. Printed in bold, capitalized letters at the top of the final sheet were 4 words that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. Durable power of attorney. Beneath that devastating heading, I could clearly read the specific clauses. It granted Natalie full, unhindered legal authority to manage, sell, transfer, or liquidate any and all real estate properties currently held in my name. It gave her direct, unquestioned access to my retirement accounts, my investment portfolios, and my primary checking balances. It completely stripped me of my legal autonomy, transferring the total ownership of my $1.8 million paid-off home directly into the greedy, desperate hands of my son-in-law. The realization hit me with the destructive force of a wrecking ball. The freezing chill in my chest radiated outward, turning my limbs to heavy lead. This was never about paying for a towed car. This was never about getting me state-subsidized health care or helping me remember to pay the electricity bill. My own flesh and blood, the daughter I had stayed up with through countless feverish nights, the little girl I had carried on my shoulders through the park, was actively trying to erase me from my own life. She was not waiting for me to pass away naturally. She and her arrogant husband were plotting to legally bury me while I was still breathing. They were going to use this forged document to sell the house right out from under my feet, evict me from the home I built with my late wife, and likely throw me into the cheapest, most miserable facility they could find, just so Derek could pay off his massive debts and Natalie could keep buying designer clothes. The sheer malice of their plan was suffocating. I sat there on my comfortable sofa, looking at the forged documents, feeling a profound, terrifying loneliness. The family I thought I had was completely dead. The woman sitting next to me, rubbing my back and calling me dad, was nothing more than a ruthless predator wearing my daughter's face. I knew I had to stop this immediately, but I could not simply refuse to sign. If I stood up and threw them out, they would know I was completely lucid. They would realize I had uncovered their scheme, and they would simply retreat, regroup, and find a darker, more dangerous way to take my home. I needed to destroy the document right here and now, but in a way that maintained my cover as a clumsy, helpless old fool. I needed a distraction, and I needed it instantly. I glanced over at the steaming cup of dark coffee resting dangerously close to the edge of the glass table. I slowly moved the heavy silver pen toward the thick stack of papers. My right hand trembled, hovering just inches above the yellow highlighted line. Natalie leaned in so close I could hear the shallow, greedy rhythm of her breathing. "Just sign it, Dad," she coaxed, her voice tight with anticipation. Almost there. Derek took a step forward from the corner of the room, his eyes locked onto the tip of the pen like a starving animal watching its prey. I let out a dry, raspy cough, lowering the pen for a moment. "My throat is just so parched," I whispered weakly, pointing a shaking finger at the ceramic mug. "Let me just take a quick sip of my coffee to clear my throat before I sign these important medical forms." Natalie sighed, rolling her eyes ever so slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, Dad. Take your time. But hurry up, the doctor has a very busy schedule today." I reached my left hand out toward the steaming cup of dark French roast resting on the very edge of the glass coffee table. I wrapped my wrinkled fingers around the ceramic handle. I lifted it about 6 inches off the table, bringing it precariously close to the pile of documents. I took a shallow breath, calculating the exact trajectory. Then I let my forearm violently spasm. It was a masterful performance. I jerked my elbow downward and twisted my wrist, releasing my grip entirely. The heavy ceramic mug slammed down against the edge of the glass table with a loud crack, tipping violently forward. A massive wave of boiling hot pitch-black coffee exploded directly across the coffee table. The scalding dark liquid crashed over the entire stack of forged legal papers. I watched with immense quiet satisfaction as the coffee rapidly soaked through the crisp white sheets. The dark stain spread aggressively across the durable power of attorney clause. More importantly, the thick black ink of the fake notary stamp immediately bled and smeared into an illegible muddy puddle. The pages warped and curled under the intense heat, permanently destroying their carefully crafted trap. "Oh no!" I cried out, throwing my hands up in the air and shrinking back against the sofa cushions. "Oh my goodness!" My hand just seized up entirely. "I am so incredibly sorry. Look at what my clumsy old hands have done to your important medical papers." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Derek let out a guttural, furious scream that echoed off the high ceilings of my living room. He lunged forward, dropping to his knees on the hardwood floor, desperately clawing at the soaked, dripping documents. He burned his expensive fingers on the scalding liquid, but he did not stop. "Are you absolutely kidding me?" he roared, his face turning a violent shade of purple. He grabbed the ruined pages, but the wet paper simply tore apart in his frantic hands, leaving him holding useless, soggy shreds of his stolen future. "Derek, calm down," Natalie hissed, glancing nervously over at the fake doctor who had suddenly jumped to his feet. "It was just an accident. We can just print out another copy and have him sign it right now." "We cannot just print another copy, you idiot!" Derek screamed at his own wife, his mask of civility completely shattering into a million jagged pieces. "The notary is not here anymore. The stamp is completely ruined. We needed these signed and filed by tomorrow morning. Do you have any idea what happens if I do not have this finalized by Friday? Do you have any concept of the people I am dealing with right now? They are going to take everything." He was panting heavily, kneeling in a puddle of spilled coffee, his expensive tailored suit ruined by the dark stains. The arrogant, composed son-in-law was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate, cornered rat. His eyes were wide with a genuine primal panic. He gripped the torn, ruined power of attorney document so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. I sat there on the sofa clutching my chest and pretending to hyperventilate from the shock, but my mind was racing with razor-sharp clarity. Derek was not just trying to steal my house to buy a nicer sports car or take a luxury vacation. His reaction was not just frustration over a delayed financial windfall. It was pure, unadulterated terror. He had casually mentioned a strict deadline. He had mentioned dangerous people. "Do you have any concept of the people I am dealing with right now?" Those words echoed in my mind. You do not talk about legitimate bank lenders or standard mortgage brokers with that kind of raw, trembling fear. You talk about loan sharks. You talk about violent criminals. Dr. Evans hastily snapped his battered leather briefcase shut. "I think I should leave," the fake doctor muttered quickly, his eyes darting toward the front door. "This is clearly a domestic issue. You can call me when you have everything sorted out." Without waiting for a response, the scam artist practically ran out of my house, letting the heavy front door slam shut behind him. Derek slowly stood up, breathing heavily through his nose. He glared at me with a look of pure, concentrated hatred. "If looks could physically kill, I would have dropped dead right there on my own living room rug. You senile, worthless old fool," he spat, pointing a shaking, coffee-stained finger directly at my face. "You ruin absolutely everything." "Derek, stop it!" Natalie commanded, grabbing his arm and pulling him back toward the hallway. "Let us just go. We will figure this out tonight. We will come up with another solid plan." She looked back at me, her fake sweetness completely erased, replaced by a cold, hard resentment. "We will be back, Dad. You just stay here and rest for now." They stormed out of my house, leaving the ruined, soggy papers sitting in a brown puddle on my glass table. I listened to the aggressive roar of his sports car engine as they sped backward down my driveway and peeled out into the street. The heavy silence of my home slowly returned, but the atmosphere had permanently shifted. I stood up from the sofa, entirely abandoning my trembling, weak posture. I rolled my shoulders back and stood up straight, looking down at the destroyed documents. A small, grim smile slowly crossed my face. It was a satisfying victory, but it was only the very first skirmish in a much larger, darker war. Derek was drowning in a very deep, very dangerous ocean of debt, and he was desperately trying to pull my entire house down with him just to stay afloat. I needed to know exactly who he owed his massive debts to, and I urgently needed to know exactly how deep his financial corruption truly went. It was time to stop playing passive defense inside my own living room. It was time to aggressively go on the offensive. I walked calmly back into the kitchen, picked up my cell phone from the cold marble counter, and immediately dialed the only man I could fully trust to help me dig up the ugly buried truth. I stood in the center of my kitchen, the ruined documents still lying on the glass table in the next room. I dialed the private cell phone number of Benjamin Ross. Benjamin and I went back more than 30 years. He was the estate and trust lawyer who had helped Carolyn and me draft our original wills, and he was the only man I knew who possessed a mind as relentlessly analytical as my own. He answered on the second ring. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I told him I needed to see him immediately, that it was a matter of absolute urgency involving my daughter and my property. He told me to come straight to his office. I did not want to leave a digital trail by ordering another ride-sharing service linked to my phone. I walked 3 blocks down to the main avenue and flagged down a traditional yellow cab. The rain had started to fall again, a steady, cold Seattle drizzle that matched the grim reality settling over me. I sat in the back of the cab watching the gray city blur past the window. I felt a strange sense of profound clarity. The shock and the heartbreak of my daughter's betrayal were still there, aching like a deep bruise, but the initial paralysis was gone. I was a man going to war, and I was going to use the law as my primary weapon. The cab dropped me off in front of a sleek, glass-fronted building in the heart of the downtown financial district. I took the elevator up to the 14th floor and walked directly into Benjamin's private office. He was standing behind his large mahogany desk, looking out at the city skyline. Benjamin was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed absolutely nothing. When he saw me, his expression softened with genuine concern. He came around the desk and shook my hand firmly, noticing the lingering stiffness in my posture from the car accident. "Victor, my God. You look terrible," he said quietly, guiding me toward one of his heavy leather guest chairs. "I heard about the crash. You should be resting in bed, not running around the city in the rain." "I do not have time to rest, Benjamin," I replied, unbuttoning my damp coat and taking a seat. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out a large manila envelope. Inside were the damp, coffee-stained remnants of the documents Derek and Natalie had tried to force me to sign. I slid the envelope across the polished mahogany wood. "I need you to look at this right now. Tell me exactly what they were trying to do to me." Benjamin frowned, putting on his reading glasses. He carefully slid the ruined, warped pages out of the envelope. He spread them across his desk, turning on a bright brass reading lamp to examine the smeared ink and the hidden clauses. For 5 long minutes, the only sound in the grand office was the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the soft rustle of stiff paper. As Benjamin read, his jaw clenched tighter and tighter. The color slowly drained from his face, replaced by a cold, professional fury. He finally took off his glasses and looked up at me, his eyes dark with serious alarm. "Victor," he started, his voice barely above a whisper, "how close were you to actually signing this document?" My pen was hovering over the paper, I told him honestly. I faked a muscle spasm and dumped my coffee over it the second I saw the header on the last page. "But I need to hear it from you. How bad is it?" "It is a complete financial death sentence," Benjamin stated flatly, tapping a finger against the ruined paper. "This is not just a standard medical release. This is a remarkably aggressive, fully weaponized, durable power of attorney. If your signature had touched this line and that fake notary had stamped it, your daughter and your son-in-law would have gained immediate, unrestricted legal control over every single asset you possess. They could empty your checking accounts by this afternoon. They could liquidate your retirement funds. And most importantly, they would have the absolute legal right to sell your house, sign the deed over to a buyer, and pocket every single penny of the $1.8 million. You would not even have a legal voice to stop them. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I knew it was bad, but hearing a legal expert confirm the sheer ruthlessness of their plan was terrifying. They would not need my permission to list the house, I asked, just to be absolutely certain. Not at all, Benjamin replied grimly. With this specific document, they essentially become you in the eyes of the law. They could evict you from your own property, sell it for cash, and legally abandon you. The wording here is incredibly precise. Whoever drafted this document for them knew exactly what they were doing. This was not downloaded off the internet. This was prepared by a highly unethical professional. Victor, this is a calculated predatory strike against your entire livelihood. I leaned back in the chair, absorbing his heavy words. Derek lost his temper when the papers were ruined, I explained slowly. He mentioned a strict deadline and very dangerous people. He is terrified, Benjamin. He is in massive financial trouble, and he is using my home to buy his way out. Benjamin leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a very determined intensity. If he owes money, we need to know who holds his debts. I will personally hire a top private investigator today. We are going to rip open his financial history. We will find every single unpaid loan and every single dirty secret he is desperately hiding from us. True to his word, Benjamin moved with the swift, unforgiving efficiency of a man who had spent his entire professional life dismantling liars in the courtroom. He did not waste a single second of our precious time. Within an hour of my leaving his downtown office, he had already retained one of the most ruthless and meticulous private financial investigators on the West Coast. I spent the next 3 days sitting entirely alone inside my quiet, empty house, carefully maintaining my fragile facade. I continued to play the part of the fading, helpless father whenever Natalie called to check on me, listening to her fake, sugary voice while my stomach twisted with absolute disgust. Every single time she asked how my memory was holding up, I knew she was secretly calculating how much longer she had to wait before she could legally steal the roof right over my head. On Friday morning, my cell phone finally buzzed with a secure text message from Benjamin. It contained only 2 urgent words. Come now. I ordered another anonymous cab and made my way back to the 14th floor of his towering glass building. When I walked into his grand office, Benjamin was not alone. Sitting comfortably in the heavy leather guest chair was a stocky, quiet man wearing a dark gray suit. He was holding a massive, thick binder overflowing with printed bank statements and digital transaction logs. Benjamin introduced him simply as a forensic accountant and an independent investigator who specialized in uncovering hidden offshore assets and deeply buried debts. Victor, please take a seat, Benjamin said gravely, gesturing to the empty chair beside the investigator. What we have meticulously uncovered over the last 72 hours is far worse than either of us could have possibly imagined. Your daughter and your son-in-law have been living an absolute lie for the last 5 years. The quiet investigator opened the heavy binder, and the entire illusion of Natalie and Derek's perfectly curated wealthy lifestyle completely shattered right before my eyes. Every single luxury they shamelessly flaunted was built on a crumbling foundation of massive, unsustainable debt. The beautiful imported sports car Derek had proudly driven to my house to intimidate me was actually heavily leased and currently 3 months behind on its payments. Their expensive designer clothes, the luxury tropical vacations they constantly posted all over social media, the high-end restaurant dinners, every single bit of it was financed through dozens of maxed-out credit cards and extremely high-interest personal loans. They were completely broke. But simply being broke was not the reason Derek had screamed in pure, unadulterated terror when my spilled coffee ruined his legal documents. The real horror was buried deep within the digital trading logs. Derek, fueled by his bottomless arrogance and a desperate, lazy desire to get rich quickly without actually working, had dove headfirst into the highly volatile, totally unregulated cryptocurrency market. He had not just invested his own meager savings. He had recklessly taken out massive, extremely risky margin loans, borrowing heavily against assets he did not even actually own to gamble on digital coins. When the crypto market inevitably crashed, Derek's leveraged financial positions were instantly liquidated by the trading platforms. He was hit with massive margin calls that he could not even begin to pay. The investigator slid a brightly highlighted spreadsheet slowly across the mahogany desk. He is currently $800,000 in the red, the investigator stated, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy or emotion. He owes roughly $400,000 to legitimate financial banking institutions, but those are clearly not the people he is terrified of. The other $400,000 is owed to an unregulated shadowy offshore lending syndicate. These are people who do not send polite collection letters in the mail, Mr. Gallagher. They send violent men to your house in the middle of the night to break your legs or do much worse. They gave Derek a strict, non-negotiable deadline to produce the cash, and that deadline is approaching very rapidly. I sat back heavily in the leather chair, feeling the oxygen slowly drain from the grand office. $800,000. My son-in-law had blindly gambled away almost $1 million on invisible internet money, and when violent criminals backed him into a dangerous corner, he immediately looked at my paid-off home as his personal financial bailout fund. But the most devastating part of this terrible revelation was not Derek's incredible stupidity. It was the crushing, undeniable realization of my own daughter's absolute complicity. Natalie was not an innocent, clueless victim in this financial disaster. She was the driving force behind it. As I stared at the detailed pages documenting her endless, frivolous spending on luxury goods while her husband was actively drowning in dangerous debt, a bitter wave of guilt and sorrow washed over me. I realized with absolute clarity that her monstrous greed was a beast that I had accidentally helped create. When Natalie was growing up, Carolyn and I had shielded her from every single hardship. I worked grueling 80-hour weeks at the engineering firm, just so she could have the finest clothes, the most expensive private tutors, and a brand new car on her 16th birthday. Whenever she made a mistake or overspent her generous allowance, I quietly stepped in and paid the difference. I bailed her out when she racked up severe credit card debt in college. I paid off Derek's early debts before their expensive wedding because I could not bear to see her cry. I thought I was showing her unconditional love. I thought I was being a good protective father by shielding her from the harsh realities of the world. Instead, I had taught her that there were absolutely no real consequences for her terrible actions. I had taught her that she was permanently entitled to a life of luxury, regardless of who had to suffer or bleed to provide it for her. Because I had always been her endless financial safety net, she had gradually grown to view me not as a human being, not as a loving father, but simply as a disposable resource. When the money finally ran out, and the violent loan sharks started circling her husband, her deeply ingrained entitlement simply overrode any lingering shred of human empathy. She genuinely believed she deserved the financial value of my house more than I deserved to live out my final years in peace and security. I closed my eyes, taking a long, incredibly shaky breath. The pain of taking responsibility for her spoiled, entitled upbringing was overwhelmingly heavy, but it also burned away the very last remnants of my paternal hesitation. The woman actively plotting to steal my life was not my sweet little girl anymore. She was a desperate, dangerous adult who was perfectly willing to sacrifice my physical safety and my home just to preserve her own fragile, expensive ego. "What is their next move?" I asked, opening my eyes and looking directly at Benjamin with newfound resolve. "The power of attorney document is completely destroyed. They know they cannot easily get another fake notary in time to meet this violent deadline. How are they planning to get the money now?" Benjamin sighed heavily, reaching out and closing the thick binder. "That is the second part of the investigation, Victor," he said grimly. "And it involves what Derek has already done with your property directly behind your back." The investigator did not say a word, as he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a second, much thinner folder. He placed it squarely on the desk in front of me, right next to the damning spreadsheet of Derek's massive cryptocurrency failures. Benjamin leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany, his face etched with a deep, uncompromising sorrow. He looked at me not just as my legal counsel, but as an old friend preparing to deliver a fatal diagnosis. What this investigator found in the shadows of the real estate market is far more insidious than a simple forged document, Benjamin said quietly. Your son-in-law did not just plan to sell your house, Victor. He has already sold it. I stared at Benjamin, my mind struggling to process the absolute impossibility of his words. That makes no sense, I stammered, my voice trembling slightly. My name is on the deed. The mortgage was paid off 20 years ago. The power of attorney was destroyed before I ever signed it. He cannot legally sell a house he does not own. The investigator opened the thin folder, revealing several grainy color photographs printed on standard copy paper. That is technically true, Mr. Gallagher, the investigator explained in his flat clinical tone. He cannot legally execute a final sale without your signature or a formalized power of attorney. But in the predatory underworld of distressed real estate, there is something called a whisper listing. It is an off-market shadow network. It is where desperate people go to quietly unload distressed properties to cash rich buyers who do not ask any questions and do not care about building inspections. Derek listed your home on one of these private networks over a month ago. I looked down at the photographs, and a wave of pure physical nausea washed over me. They were pictures of my home, but they were not taken from the public street. They were interior shots. There was a photo of my living room showing the antique grandfather clock Carolyn and I bought on our 10th anniversary. There was a picture of my kitchen highlighting the custom marble countertops I installed with my own 2 hands. There was even a photograph of my master bedroom capturing the edge of the bed where my wife took her very last breath. Natalie had taken these photos. My own daughter had walked through my sacred private sanctuary while I was making her coffee, secretly snapping pictures on her phone to advertise my entire life to predatory scavengers. The investigator pointed a thick finger at a digitally printed contract sitting beneath the photographs. 3 weeks ago, Derek found a buyer, the investigator continued relentlessly. The buyer is a notorious local house flipper who specializes in aggressive evictions and rapid, cheap renovations. He is a man who preys on families going through bankruptcies or messy divorces. Derek entered into a shadow agreement with this man. He promised to deliver the clean, unencumbered title to your property at a severely discounted cash price. In exchange for this massive discount, the flipper agreed to bypass all standard escrow procedures and hand over a $50,000 non-refundable cash deposit immediately. I felt the blood drain completely from my face. My beautifully maintained, paid-off home had been bargained away for a fraction of its true value by a desperate coward. Derek took the deposit. I whispered, staring blindly at the printed contract. He took the $50,000 the very next day, the investigator confirmed. He used a portion of that money to pay the retainer fee for the corrupt lawyer who drafted the fake power of attorney. Natalie used another portion to buy a designer dress to maintain their wealthy public facade. But the bulk went straight to the loan sharks to buy Derek a tiny fraction of time. It bought him exactly 10 days. The contract stipulates that if Derek does not produce the legally transferred deed within 10 days, the buyer keeps the house through aggressive litigation and sues Derek for triple damages. That is exactly why Derek absolutely lost his mind when you spilled the coffee, Benjamin interjected, his voice hardening with righteous anger. You did not just ruin his paperwork, Victor. You pushed him right to the absolute edge of a fatal cliff. His 10-day deadline is up this Friday. If he does not hand over your house, the loan sharks will come for his blood, and the shady real estate flipper will destroy whatever tiny piece of his financial life is left. He is trapped in a burning room, and he is trying to use your dead body to smother the flames. I sat frozen in the heavy leather chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. The grand office around me seemed to fade away, replaced by the crushing weight of a profound psychological crisis. My home was not just a building. It was the physical manifestation of my entire life of work. Every wooden floorboard, every painted wall, every single quiet corner was saturated with 50 years of blood, sweat, and profound love. It was my safe haven, the only place in the world where I felt truly close to the memory of my beloved wife. And my daughter had quietly opened the back door to let a pack of starving wolves inside. The sting of being sold out by my own flesh and blood burned hotter than any physical fire. I thought of the many long hours I spent working overtime to ensure Natalie always had everything. They casually put a cheap price tag on my sanctuary, auctioning off all my memories to save their own worthless vanity. I stared down at the photograph of my master bedroom, and the crushing sorrow in my chest finally crystallized into something entirely different. It immediately hardened into cold, unbreakable, and absolute steel. It was officially time for me to fight back. I left Benjamin's office with a heavy heart, but a completely clear mind. The cab ride back to Magnolia felt entirely different this time. I was no longer a confused, grieving father, trying to understand why his family had turned against him. I was a man who had just been handed the blueprints of his own planned execution. The rain had stopped, leaving the Seattle streets slick and reflecting the harsh glare of the streetlights. When I finally unlocked my front door and stepped inside, the silence of the house did not feel lonely anymore. It felt like the quiet before a massive storm. I walked past the glass coffee table where the faint brown stains of my spilled coffee still lingered on the edges, a permanent reminder of the war that had just been declared in my own living room. I went into my study and sat down in the heavy leather armchair behind my desk. I pulled out my tablet. I needed to see what Natalie was doing right now. I needed to look at the face of the woman who had casually placed a $50,000 bounty on my home. I opened her social media profile. Natalie lived her entire life online, carefully curating a fake reality for her wealthy friends to admire. Her latest post had been uploaded just 3 hours ago. It was a perfectly staged photograph taken at one of the most exclusive, expensive restaurants in the downtown area. She was sitting at a candlelit table holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne, smiling radiantly at the camera. But it was not her smile that caught my attention. It was what she was wearing. She was dressed in a stunning midnight blue designer gown. Even with my limited knowledge of high fashion, I recognized the unmistakable cut and the discreet logo of a brand new Prada dress. The caption beneath the photo read, "Celebrating new beginnings and bright futures with my amazing husband." A sickening feeling began to rise in the back of my throat. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thin folder the investigator had given me. I opened the financial spreadsheet and traced my finger down the column of Derek and Natalie's recent transactions. I found the exact date and time the corrupt real estate flipper had wired the $50,000 non-refundable deposit into Derek's secret offshore account. Then I looked at the timestamp of the credit card charge from the high-end boutique where the dress was purchased. The transaction had occurred exactly 4 hours after the shadow deposit had cleared. 4 hours. My daughter had essentially sold the roof over my head, sold the very walls where her mother had lived and died, and immediately walked straight into a luxury designer store to reward herself. She had wrapped herself in a $5,000 dress, paid for entirely with the blood money of my stolen legacy. The stolen $4,500 from my Chase Sapphire card was just the beginning, a small taste to satisfy her absolute greed while she waited for the main course. I stared at the glowing screen of the tablet, looking deeply into her dark, smiling eyes. I searched for any trace of the little girl I had raised. I looked for the child who used to hold my hand tightly when we walked through the park. The teenager who had cried on my shoulder when she experienced her first heartbreak. I searched desperately for a single ounce of genuine human soul behind that perfectly painted face. There was absolutely nothing there. She was an empty, bottomless void of vanity and dark entitlement. She was drinking champagne and toasting to her bright future, while fully knowing that her actions would leave her own father homeless, penniless, and entirely broken. In that quiet, dimly lit study, something fundamental shifted inside my chest. It was not a violent explosion of anger. It was a quiet, profound, and irreversible death. The forgiving, endlessly patient father, who had always made excuses for her terrible behavior, simply ceased to exist. He died right there in that leather chair, completely starved of love and suffocated by betrayal. The man who had bailed her out of every financial mistake, the man who had blindly paid for her lavish wedding, the man who had always chosen peace over discipline, was gone forever. He was never coming back. What was left behind was the cold, calculating mind of an engineer who was staring at a critically flawed structure that needed to be completely demolished. Natalie and Derek had severely miscalculated. They thought they were dealing with a weak, senile victim who would quietly fade away into the background and let them take everything he had built. They had no idea that their greed had just awakened a sleeping giant. I set the tablet face down on the solid wood desk. I did not feel any more sadness. I did not feel any more hesitation. I felt a cold, sharp focus that was sharper than a surgical scalpel. I was going to let them think they had won. I was going to let them feel the absolute thrill of victory right up until the very last possible second. And then I was going to pull the ground entirely out from under their feet. I was going to strip away their fake wealth, their arrogant pride, and their stolen future. I was going to teach them the hardest, most devastating lesson of their miserable lives. No more second chances, no more financial bailouts, no more mercy. I reached for my cell phone to call Benjamin and tell him to prepare the final stages of our trap, but before my fingers could even touch the screen, the device suddenly buzzed violently in my hand. The caller ID flashing on the bright screen made my tired blood run instantly cold. It was the local Seattle Police Department calling me directly. I stared at the glowing screen of my cell phone for a long moment. The bold letters reading Seattle Police Department seemed to pulse with an ominous rhythm in the quiet study. My mind raced through a dozen different terrifying scenarios. Had Derek and Natalie preemptively called the authorities to report me as a danger to myself? Had they filed a false report to accelerate their legal theft? I took a deep breath, braced myself for whatever fresh nightmare was waiting on the other end, and slid my thumb across the screen to answer the call. "Hello, this is Victor Gallagher," I said, keeping my voice as steady and calm as possible. "Mr. Gallagher," a deep, gravelly voice replied. "This is Detective Harrison with the Seattle Police Department Traffic Collision Investigation Squad. I apologize for calling so late in the evening. I hope I am not interrupting anything important." "No, Detective, you are not interrupting," I answered, my brow furrowing in confusion. "The Traffic Collision Squad. I assumed my accident report was completely finalized days ago. The officers at the scene cited the heavy rain and slick road conditions as the primary cause of my crash. That is what we initially believed as well," Sir Detective Harrison said. His tone was professional, but there was a sharp underlying tension in his words that immediately put me on high alert. "However, protocol requires us to conduct a secondary mechanical inspection on vehicles involved in severe single-car rollovers, especially when the insurance claim is substantial. Our forensic mechanics towed your crushed SUV from the temporary storage lot over to the main city scrapyard earlier this afternoon to complete their final evaluation." I listened intently, my grip tightening on the edge of my wooden desk. "Did they find something wrong with my insurance paperwork?" I asked, still trying to connect the dots. "No, Mr. Gallagher," the detective replied slowly, letting the heavy silence stretch out for a fraction of a second. "They found something wrong with your vehicle. Specifically, we have uncovered some highly irregular mechanical anomalies. I cannot discuss the details over an unsecured phone line, but my captain has authorized me to contact you immediately. We need you to come down to the municipal scrapyard in the industrial district right now." We need you to visually identify the vehicle and officially confirm who had access to it prior to the crash. We are no longer looking at this as a simple weather-related accident. We are now dealing with criminal findings. The phrase criminal findings hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Before I could even ask him to elaborate, he gave me the exact address of the impound lot and ended the call. I slowly lowered the phone, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The car crash was not an accident. My mind desperately tried to reject the implication, but the cold, analytical engineer inside me started rapidly calculating the terrible variables. I was just reaching for my coat when my phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID showed Benjamin Ross. I answered it immediately. "Victor, tell me you are still at the house," Benjamin said urgently, his usually calm voice tight with poorly concealed anxiety. "I am here," I said. "I just got a call from a Detective Harrison." "I know," Benjamin interrupted. "Harrison just called my office. He reached out to me because I am listed as your primary emergency legal counsel on your insurance filings. Victor, whatever is happening right now, it has completely changed the scope of our entire situation. We are no longer just dealing with a forged power of attorney or a shady real estate transaction. Harrison is a veteran detective in the Major Crimes Division, despite his title in the traffic squad. If he is calling us down to a scrapyard in the middle of the night to discuss criminal findings, it means someone actively tampered with your car." "Are you saying someone tried to kill me?" I whispered, the horrifying reality finally beginning to crystallize in my mind. "I am saying you need to get into a cab right this second and meet me at the Industrial District impound lot," Benjamin commanded firmly. "Do not call your daughter. Do not call your son-in-law. Do not tell anyone where you are going. I am leaving my office right now. I will see you there in 20 minutes. The line went dead. I stood completely frozen in my study for a few seconds. The sheer magnitude of the evil I was facing was almost incomprehensible. Stealing my house was a crime of greed, a pathetic act of financial desperation. But sabotaging my vehicle to cause a fatal rollover crash on a slick highway, that was premeditated, cold-blooded murder. I grabbed my heavy wool coat, walked out the front door, and locked it securely behind me. The rain had started to fall again, a freezing, relentless downpour that soaked through my clothes in seconds. I flagged down a passing taxi and gave the driver the address. As the cab sped southward away from my quiet neighborhood and toward the gritty, desolate industrial sector of the city, I stared out the window and played the memory of the crash over and over in my head. I remembered driving down the steep, winding road near the highway overpass. The rain was coming down in sheets, but I was not speeding. I had driven that exact route 1,000 times over the last 40 years. As I approached the sharpest curve, I pressed my foot firmly down on the brake pedal to reduce my speed. But the pedal had felt strange. It had felt dangerously soft, pressing all the way down to the floorboard with absolutely no resistance. There was no hydraulic pressure. The car had not slowed down at all. It had accelerated into the turn tires, hydroplaning violently across the slick asphalt before smashing through the metal guardrail and tumbling down into the deep, muddy ditch. I closed my eyes, feeling a sick, twisting knot form deep in my stomach. I remembered the night before the crash. Derek had come over to the house. He told me the windshield wipers on his sports car were acting up and asked if he could pull his car into my spacious, well-lit garage to swap out the blades. He was in my garage alone with my SUV and all of my heavy tools for nearly 2 hours. I had even brought him a cup of coffee. I had smiled at the man who was actively preparing my death. The cab jolted to a sudden stop, snapping me back to the present. We were parked outside a massive chain-link fence topped with coils of rusted barbed wire. The harsh, blinding glare of industrial floodlights illuminated rows upon rows of crushed, mangled vehicles sitting in the muddy lot. I paid the driver and stepped out into the freezing rain. Benjamin was already standing by the heavy metal gate, holding a large black umbrella. Beside him stood a tall, broad-shouldered man in a thick raincoat holding a heavy-duty flashlight. It was Detective Harrison. Benjamin placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder as I walked up, but his face was grim and pale in the harsh light. "Mr. Gallagher," the detective said quietly, extending a gloved hand. "Thank you for coming down here so quickly. I know this is a terrible shock, but I need you to see exactly what my mechanics found. Follow me, please." We walked in silence through the dark, muddy aisles of the scrapyard. The smell of leaking motor oil and wet rust hung heavily in the freezing air. Finally, we stopped in a clearing near the back of the lot. Sitting under the harsh glare of a portable halogen worklight was the mangled, crushed shell of my SUV. The front end was completely destroyed, the windshield shattered into a million tiny fragments. The detective walked up to the front wheel, well crouched down in the mud, and clicked on his heavy flashlight. "I need you to look very closely right here, Mr. Gallagher," the detective said, pointing the bright beam of light deep into the exposed undercarriage of the wrecked vehicle. "What you are about to see changes absolutely everything." I kneeled down in the cold mud beside Detective Harrison. The freezing rain soaked through the knees of my trousers, but I barely felt the chill. My entire focus was locked onto the narrow beam of the heavy flashlight, piercing the dark, mangled underbelly of my destroyed vehicle. The detective reached into the twisted metal with a gloved hand and gently pulled out a thick, rubber-coated, steel-braided hose. It was the primary hydraulic brake line, the very component that had completely failed me when I tried to slow down on that steep, rain-slicked highway curve. "Take a close look at the point of separation, Mr. Gallagher," Detective Harrison instructed, keeping his voice incredibly calm and measured over the sound of the pouring rain. "In a standard high-speed collision, especially a violent rollover, components tear apart under massive stress. When a brake line snaps from blunt force trauma, the metal braiding frays at the edges. The rubber casing stretches and completely shreds, leaving a jagged, uneven mess. That is what our traffic investigators initially assumed happened when they first inspected the wreckage at the crash site." He moved the flashlight closer, illuminating the end of the severed hose. But the end of this hose was not jagged. It was not frayed, stretched, or torn. It was completely smooth. The cut was perfectly straight, sharp, and incredibly precise, slicing through the thick rubber and the inner steel mesh with absolute surgical efficiency. "That is a clean mechanical shear," the detective stated, confirming the horrific truth my engineering brain had already recognized. "Someone did not just tamper with your vehicle, Victor. Someone crawled under this chassis with a pair of heavy-duty industrial-grade wire cutters and deliberately severed your primary brake line. They did not cut it all the way through initially. They left just enough of the inner lining intact so that the fluid would not immediately bleed out on your driveway. They intentionally designed it to completely fail only when you applied maximum hydraulic pressure, like when you needed to brake hard on a dangerous, winding road." Benjamin stood silently behind me, holding the large black umbrella over our heads, but his presence offered no comfort against the crushing, suffocating weight of the detective's words. I slowly stood up, my joints aching with a sudden, profound exhaustion. I stared at the severed hose, and the final horrifying puzzle piece slammed into place with devastating clarity. The night before the accident, Derek had stopped by my house unannounced. It was raining heavily that evening, just like it was now. He had complained that the windshield wipers on his luxury sports car were malfunctioning, and asked if he could pull into my spacious, well-lit garage to replace them out of the weather. I had gladly opened the garage door for him. I had left him completely alone with my SUV and my extensive collection of heavy tools for over 2 hours. I even remembered walking out there to bring him a hot cup of coffee. I had smiled warmly at the man who was lying on the cold concrete floor, covered in grease, actively preparing my brutal execution. The sheer, absolute evil of the plan washed over me. The forged, durable power of attorney document, the fake doctor, the secret shadow listing of my home on the real estate market. None of those were Derek's original plan. Those were merely his desperate backup strategies. They were the chaotic, panicked actions of a man whose primary scheme had failed. Plan A was murder. It was simple, ruthless, and highly effective. According to the original will that Benjamin had drafted for Carolyn and me decades ago, my entire estate, including the $1.8 million paid-off house, would automatically pass directly to Natalie in the event of my death. There would be no complicated legal hurdles, no suspicious signatures to forge, and no risky fake medical evaluations. If my car had plunged off that steep embankment, and I had died in the wreckage, the police would have simply ruled it a tragic weather-related accident involving an elderly driver. Natalie would have inherited everything free and clear. Derek could have immediately sold the house, paid off his dangerous offshore loan sharks, and continued living his wealthy fake lifestyle without anyone ever asking a single question. The only reason Derek had been screaming in absolute terror when I spilled coffee on his forged paperwork was because I had miraculously survived the crash. My survival had completely ruined his perfect lethal timeline. He was trapped because I was still breathing. "Are you all right, Victor?" Benjamin asked softly, placing a steadying hand on my wet shoulder. "You look like you might pass out." "I am fine, Benjamin," I whispered, though my voice sounded completely foreign to my own ears. It was hollow, stripped of all warmth and all lingering parental delusion. I turned away from the crushed vehicle and faced the detective. "Do you have enough physical evidence to arrest him for this?" Detective Harrison clicked off the heavy flashlight and stood up, wiping the freezing rain from his face. "We have the severed brake line, and we can easily prove the cut was deliberate," he explained carefully. "But proving exactly who held the wire cutters is a much higher legal hurdle. We need physical evidence placing Derek under your vehicle with the specific tools used to commit the crime. A good defense attorney could argue that someone else tampered with your car while it was parked at a grocery store or left out on the street. Without a confession or direct visual proof of Derek committing the act, an attempted murder charge might not stick in front of a jury." I looked back at my destroyed SUV, feeling a dark, powerful energy rising rapidly in my chest. The sorrow was completely gone. The heartbreak had been entirely burned away, leaving behind a cold, calculating machine. Derek thought he was so incredibly smart. He thought he could sneak into my garage, use my own tools against me, and simply walk away with my entire life. But he had forgotten one crucial detail about the man he was trying to kill. He had forgotten that I spent my entire career anticipating structural failures and designing fail-safes. I did not just trust people blindly. I always verified. "I have the proof you need, detective," I said, my voice cutting sharply through the sound of the falling rain. The words hung in the freezing air, heavy with the promise of absolute destruction. Benjamin and Harrison both stared at me in stunned silence. "What kind of proof?" the detective asked, his eyes narrowing with sudden intense interest. I looked him dead in the eye, feeling the corners of my mouth turn up into a grim, merciless smile. "I have something much better than a confession. We need to go back to my house right now." The ride back from the desolate industrial scrapyard to my quiet neighborhood was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. Detective Harrison followed closely behind our yellow cab in his unmarked police cruiser, the headlights piercing through the relentless, freezing Seattle downpour. I sat in the back seat next to Benjamin, staring out at the blurred city lights, my mind humming with a dark electric energy. The sorrow and disbelief that had weighed me down for the past week had completely evaporated. In their place was a profound, icy clarity. I was no longer a grieving father. I was an engineer who had just located the exact source of a catastrophic structural failure, and I was preparing to bring the entire compromised building down to its foundation. We pulled into my driveway, the wet gravel crunching loudly beneath the tires. I unlocked the heavy front door and led the two men out of the freezing rain and directly into my warm, dimly lit study. Detective Harrison shook the water from his thick raincoat, his sharp eyes scanning the room with professional curiosity. Benjamin closed the door firmly behind us, leaning against the heavy wood frame, waiting for me to explain the bold promise I had just made in the mud. I walked around my solid oak desk and booted up my desktop computer, Several months ago, I explained smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly level as the machine hummed to life. I noticed that some of my most expensive, specialized tools were going missing from the garage. We are talking about high-end torque wrenches, precision calipers, and industrial pneumatic equipment. At first, I thought my memory was simply slipping, or perhaps I had misplaced them after a long project. But when a brand new heavy-duty power drill vanished right out of its protective case, I knew someone was taking them. I assumed it was a careless neighborhood kid, or perhaps a contracted landscaper trying to make a quick buck. I opened my secure web browser and navigated to a private encrypted cloud storage portal. So being a man who relies heavily on accurate data and verifiable facts, I decided to quietly solve the mystery myself. I purchased a state-of-the-art, motion-activated micro-security camera. It is a tiny wireless device equipped with a wide-angle lens and high-definition night vision capabilities. I discreetly mounted it high up on the ceiling rafters tucked safely behind a wooden support beam. It overlooks the entire tool bench and points directly downward at the primary parking bay where I keep my vehicle. It is completely invisible unless you know exactly where to look. I never told my daughter about it. I certainly never told my son-in-law. The detective stepped closer to the desk, resting his large hands on the back of my leather armchair. His professional skepticism was rapidly transforming into genuine anticipation. "And you believe this hidden camera captured him tampering with the vehicle?" the detective asked, his voice low and tight. "Let us find out," I replied coldly. I typed in my complex password and accessed the digital video archive. The screen populated with hundreds of tiny video thumbnails, each one representing a motion-triggered event over the past few months. I quickly filtered the search parameters, isolating the specific date and time frame of the evening before my catastrophic accident. The screen cleared, leaving only a handful of video files. I clicked on the one timestamped at exactly 2:14 in the morning. The video player expanded to fill the entire monitor. The high-definition night vision rendered the dark garage in crisp, eerie shades of black and white. For a few seconds, the screen was completely still, showing only the smooth hood of my parked SUV. Then the heavy door connecting the garage to the main hallway slowly creaked open. A figure stepped into the frame. The resolution was flawless. There was absolutely no ambiguity, no shadow of a doubt, and no room for a clever defense attorney to argue mistaken identity. It was Derek. He was wearing dark clothes, but his arrogant face was perfectly illuminated by the infrared sensors as he looked around the supposedly empty space. Benjamin let out a sharp, ragged breath, leaning closer to the glowing monitor. "Good Lord," the lawyer whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and absolute disgust. "He really did it." We watched in complete, breathless silence as the digital recording played out his treacherous crime. Derek did not walk over to the front of the vehicle to inspect the windshield wipers, which was the entire excuse he had used to borrow my garage in the first place. Instead, he walked directly over to my heavy metal tool chest. He opened the bottom drawer with practiced familiarity and pulled out my heavy-duty industrial wire cutters. The very same cutters the detective had described just an hour earlier. Derek then pulled a wooden mechanic creeper out from under the workbench. He lay down flat on his back, gripping the heavy steel cutters tightly in his right hand, and smoothly rolled himself directly underneath the front carriage of my SUV. He remained entirely out of sight beneath the heavy vehicle for exactly 4 agonizing minutes. When he finally rolled back out, his chest was heaving with exertion. He casually tossed my wire cutters back into the toolbox, wiped his greasy hands on a blue shop towel, and quietly slipped back into the house, closing the heavy door behind him. The video ended, leaving a frozen frame of the empty garage. The silence in my study was absolute and deafening. The digital clock on the bottom corner of the monitor read 2:18 in the morning. The proof was ironclad. It was not circumstantial. It was a digital confession recorded in high definition, capturing a man meticulously preparing to murder his own father-in-law without showing even a single shred of basic human remorse. Detective Harrison let out a long, heavy breath, finally breaking the absolute silence in the study. He reached down to his dark leather duty belt, his hand resting instinctively on his police radio. "I have seen a lot of terrible things in my career, Mr. Gallagher," the detective said, his voice hard, with professional and righteous anger. "But the sheer casual cruelty of that video is something else entirely. I am calling this in right now. I can have a patrol unit at their house in 10 minutes to take him into custody for attempted murder." I placed my hand firmly over the detective's thick wrist, stopping him before he could even unclip the radio. "No," I said, my voice dangerously calm and incredibly steady. "Do not arrest him tonight." Benjamin stepped forward from the shadows of the bookshelf, his brow furrowed in deep legal confusion. "Victor, what in the world are you talking about? We have him on high-definition video, actively sabotaging your vehicle. He literally tried to kill you. We need to lock him up right now before he panics and tries something else. If you arrest him tonight, you only catch him for the physical act of cutting the brake line," I explained, looking back at the frozen black and white image of my empty garage on the computer monitor. "He will immediately hire a slippery, expensive defense attorney. He will claim he was just trying to fix a leak and made a terrible accidental mechanical mistake. He might even try to plead temporary insanity due to his massive financial stress. But more importantly, if you arrest him right now, the rest of the rats will immediately scatter into the walls." I turned away from the desk to face both of them, my mind rapidly assembling the structural components of the ultimate trap. Think about the entire picture. Derek is not acting alone in a vacuum. He has a corrupt real estate flipper waiting in the shadows with a $50,000 cash deposit. He has a fake state doctor willing to forge binding legal documents. And he has my daughter, Natalie, who is entirely complicit in the financial fraud. If you arrest Derek tonight, Natalie will simply play the innocent, devastated wife. The corrupt flipper will disappear into the wind. The fake notary will completely vanish. We will only bring down one pillar of their criminal enterprise. I do not want to just break a window. I want to bring down the entire building. Detective Harrison slowly crossed his arms, leaning back against the heavy wooden doorframe. "All right, Mr. Gallagher, I am listening. What exactly do you have in mind?" "Derek's absolute weakness is his Friday deadline." I began laying out the timeline with the mathematical precision of an engineer drafting a blueprint. "He is utterly terrified of the offshore loan sharks, and he is legally bound to deliver the clean title of my house to the shadow buyer by the end of the week. He failed to kill me, and I ruined his forged power of attorney with my spilled coffee. Right now, he is sitting in his expensive, heavily leased house panicking because he has completely run out of options. We need to give him a new option. We need to hand him a golden opportunity on a silver platter, one that is so incredibly tempting he will gladly walk all of his accomplices straight into our waiting net." Benjamin's eyes widened as his sharp legal mind began to see the architecture of my plan. "You want to trick him into attempting the real estate fraud again, but this time with us watching." "Exactly," I nodded. "But we cannot just invite him over for afternoon tea. It has to be a medical emergency. A situation so dire and chaotic that he completely drops his guard and rushes the legal process. Tomorrow morning, I am going to suffer a severe life-threatening medical crisis. We will claim it is a delayed cardiac event caused by the extreme physical trauma of the car rollover. I will be rushed back to the hospital in an ambulance with the sirens blaring." I looked at the detective to ensure he was following the logistics. "I will need your help to secure a private room at the local hospital. A room secretly equipped with hidden cameras and audio recording devices. Once I am in that hospital bed, playing the role of a dying, terrified old man, I am going to call my daughter. I will tell her that my heart is completely failing. I will tell her that I am scared and that I finally realize I need her help to manage my affairs before I pass away. I will practically beg them to bring those medical release forms and the power of attorney back to me so I can sign them to cover my impending medical debts." Detective Harrison slowly nodded, a grim smile of profound respect forming on his weathered face. "If they take the bait, They will bring the forged documents directly into a police sting operation. They will be actively committing felony wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and severe elder abuse, all while we record every single word. And they will have to bring the fake notary with them. Benjamin added, his voice vibrating with anticipation. A power of attorney is entirely useless without a certified stamp. When they present that document to you in the hospital room, we will have them dead to rights on the financial crimes. And once those handcuffs click, we introduce the video of the garage. We establish the clear, undeniable motive. He tried to kill you to get the house. When that failed, he tried to steal it while you were supposedly dying. It ties the attempted murder and the financial fraud into one massive, inescapable federal case. The room fell silent again as the sheer weight and brilliance of the plan settled over us. It was a flawless, airtight trap. It required immense patience, and it required me to look my daughter in the eyes and play the pathetic, broken victim one last time. But I was more than ready. It is a brilliant strategy, Mr. Gallagher. Detective Harrison finally said, extending his hand to me. I will coordinate with the district attorney and the hospital administration first thing in the morning. We will set the stage perfectly, and I will have the irrevocable charitable trust documents finalized by tomorrow afternoon, Benjamin promised, shaking my hand warmly. When they walk into that room expecting a fortune, we are going to hand them absolute ruin. They left my house shortly after 3 in the morning. I sat alone in my dark study listening to the rain, finally slow to a soft drizzle against the cold window pane. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat in the quiet, mentally rehearsing every single line, every single trembling breath, and every single tear I was going to shed. The final act of this dark play was about to begin, and I was going to deliver the performance of a lifetime. The pale morning light slowly crept through the large bay windows of my study, washing away the shadows of a long, sleepless night. I sat perfectly still in my leather armchair, watching the rain gently streak the glass. Today was the day. Thursday. Derek had exactly 24 hours left to deliver the clear title of my house to his shadow buyer before the violent loan sharks came to collect his debt in blood. I knew the tension inside their heavily leased luxury home must be absolutely suffocating by now. I could almost picture Derek pacing back and forth across their expensive rugs, chewing his fingernails, down to the quick, staring at his phone, and praying for a miracle. I was about to give him that exact miracle. At precisely 10 in the morning, I stood up from my desk and began to prepare my body for the performance. I needed to sound genuinely distressed, not just mildly uncomfortable. I did 30 deep squats, pushing my 76-year-old knees to their absolute limit, until my heart was pounding fiercely against my ribs and my lungs were burning for oxygen. I let out a series of ragged, wet coughs, making my throat raw and raspy. I grabbed my cell phone with a trembling, sweaty hand and dialed Natalie's number. I pressed the phone to my ear, leaning heavily against the solid oak desk, dragging in loud, desperate breaths. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was sharp, clipped, and deeply annoyed. Dad. I am right in the middle of a very important morning meeting. Can this please wait until later? I let out a loud, agonizing groan, practically dropping the phone away from my mouth before bringing it back. Natalie. I gasped, my voice breaking into a terrified, pathetic wheeze. Natalie, please help me. Something is terribly wrong. My chest. It feels like someone is standing on my chest. I cannot breathe. The pain is radiating all down my left arm and up into my jaw. There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The annoyance vanished instantly, but what replaced it was not the pure, panicked terror of a loving daughter realizing her father was dying. It was a completely different kind of shock. It was the electric, breathless pause of a predator hearing a wounded animal thrash in the bushes. Dad. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice tight, suddenly dropping to a hushed whisper so no one else in her supposed meeting could hear. "Are you having a heart attack?" "I think so," I whimpered, letting a dry sob escape my raw throat. "I am so incredibly scared, sweetheart. The pain is just unbelievable." I managed to call 911. The dispatcher told me the ambulance is already on its way. They are taking me to Seattle General Hospital. "But Natalie, listen to me. Please, you have to listen to me right now." "I am listening, Dad," she said quickly. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the background. She was leaving the room, likely rushing to find Derek to share the incredible news that my body was finally doing the job they had tried to do in my garage. I was so foolish, I cried out, pouring every ounce of manufactured regret and absolute terror into my voice. I was so incredibly stubborn and proud. Sitting here all alone this week, feeling my body fail me, I finally realized how wrong I was to fight you and Derek. You were just trying to help me. You were right about everything. My memory is fading, my health is completely failing, and now this. If I survive this heart attack, the medical bills are going to be absolutely astronomical. I will need long-term care. I will need specialized facilities. I cannot manage any of this alone anymore. "Dad, try to stay calm," she coaxed. Her voice was dripping with that same fake sugary sweetness she had used the day before, but underneath it I could hear the unmistakable vibration of pure greed. "We are here for you. Derek and I are going to take care of everything." "The papers," I gasped, coughing violently into the phone. "The medical release forms and the power of attorney. The ones my clumsy hands ruined with the coffee." "Did you print new copies? Do you still have them?" "Yes," she answered immediately, far too quickly for someone whose father was supposedly dying. "Yes, Dad, we have clean copies printed and ready." "Bring them to the hospital," I begged, letting my voice drop to a weak, defeated whisper. "Bring them to my room as soon as they get me settled. Bring that doctor with you to witness it." "I do not think I have much time left, Natalie. I feel like I am fading away. I need to sign the house over to you so you can sell it and use the money to pay for my medical treatments. Paying for my care is the only thing that matters right now. Just bring the papers tomorrow morning. Please promise me you will bring them." "I promise, Dad." She breathed her words coated in a thick layer of triumphant excitement. "Do not you worry about a single thing. Derek and I will be at the hospital first thing tomorrow morning, with all the paperwork and the state representative. We will get everything officially signed and notarized just like you want. Just hold on." I let out one final sigh and ended the call. I lowered the phone. My breathing quickly returned to a calm, steady rhythm. A cold smile stretched across my face. She took the bait completely. Her blinding greed had overridden any basic sense of caution. She was not thinking about the incredibly convenient timing of my sudden heart failure. She was only thinking about the prize. Outside my window, the distant siren began to wail. Perfect. It was Friday morning, exactly 1 week to the very day since my vehicle had been forced off the slick highway into the dark ravine. The hospital corridors were bustling with the quiet, urgent energy of the early shift nurses moving swiftly between rooms with rolling carts of medication and clean linens. But I was not lying in one of those uncomfortable beds waiting for a morning evaluation. I was sitting inside a cramped, windowless security monitoring room located just 2 doors down the hall from room 412. The small space smelled strongly of stale coffee and electronic ozone. Detective Harrison stood to my left, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes locked onto the glowing wall of digital monitors. Benjamin Ross sat beside me on a metal folding chair, a thick file folder resting patiently on his lap. We were watching the live feed from 3 separate high-definition cameras that had been discreetly installed by the police technical team overnight. One camera covered the main hallway. 2 others were positioned perfectly inside the private hospital room, capturing every single angle and equipped with highly sensitive audio microphones. The digital clock on the bottom corner of the screen ticked forward to 9 in the morning. This was the absolute limit of Derek's timeline. He needed the signed documents in his hands today to satisfy the loan sharks and complete the shadow sale of my home. If he failed today, his entire world would violently collapse. Suddenly, the camera feed capturing the main elevator bank flickered with movement. The heavy steel doors slid open, and 3 familiar figures stepped out onto the polished linoleum floor. I leaned closer to the monitor, feeling my jaw clench with a cold, mechanical precision. It was Natalie Derek, and the fake state medical representative we had met in my living room, Dr. Evans. They were walking with the brisk, undeniable confidence of people who firmly believed they had already won the ultimate prize. Natalie was wearing another incredibly expensive designer outfit, a sharp tailored blazer, and pristine shoes, looking far more prepared for a luxury brunch than a final bedside vigil for her dying father. She held a large designer handbag, swinging it casually at her side. Derek walked just half a step ahead of her. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes revealing the massive toll of his financial terror, but his posture was aggressive and intensely focused. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Dr. Evans trailed slightly behind them, clutching his battered brown leather briefcase to his chest. That briefcase held the newly printed forged power of attorney, the fake notary stamp, and the completely illegal transfer deeds. They were walking directly into a federal trap, carrying all the physical evidence required to lock them inside a concrete prison cell for decades. The hidden audio microphones mounted in the ceiling panels of the hallway picked up their quiet voices as they approached the door to room 412. "Remember what we discussed?" Derek whispered harshly, stopping just a few feet away from the wooden door. He turned to face Natalie and the fake doctor. "We go in, we act deeply concerned, and we get the signatures immediately. Do not give him time to read anything. Just guide his hand if he is too weak to hold the pen. The buyer is waiting at the downtown escrow office right now. I need to be walking out of this hospital with that signed deed in exactly 15 minutes. Natalie nodded, smoothing the front of her expensive blazer with a perfectly manicured hand. "I know how to handle my own father, Derek," she replied, her voice dripping with absolute arrogance and a sickening lack of empathy. "He practically begged me on the phone yesterday. He is terrified of the medical bills. He will sign anything we put in front of him just to feel like he is being taken care of. Let me do the talking. You just make sure the notary stamp is clear this time. No more accidents. We are walking out of here as millionaires today." Dr. Evans patted his briefcase with a greasy, confident smile. "Do not worry about a thing," he murmured quietly. "I brought 2 backup stamps just in case the old man gets clumsy again. Let us go get your property." Derek reached out and grabbed the silver handle of the heavy wooden door. He pushed it open with a forceful, triumphant motion, stepping wide to allow Natalie to enter first. The hidden cameras inside the room seamlessly picked up the feed as the 3 conspirators confidently strode into the private medical suite. The room was well lit by the morning sun streaming through the large window. But the triumphant, predatory smiles completely vanished from their faces the very second they crossed the threshold. The audio feed picked up the sharp, sudden intake of breath from my daughter. Derek froze dead in his tracks, his expensive leather shoes squeaking sharply against the clean hospital floor. The room was entirely silent. The steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitors was missing. The hum of the oxygen machine was absent. And the hospital bed resting in the center of the room was not occupied by a weak old man waiting to sign away his life's work. The bed was completely empty. The thin white medical sheets were folded perfectly tight, with crisp, sharp military precision. The pillows were fluffed and untouched. The rolling tray table was pushed neatly into the corner. The room looked entirely sterile and abandoned. A sudden, terrifying tonal shift crashed over the 3 villains, like a freezing wave of Arctic water. The smugness melted into profound confusion. Derek frantically spun around, his panicked eyes darting toward the small adjoining bathroom. pushing the door wide open only to find dark, empty tiles. "Where is he?" Derek demanded, his voice trembling. "Where is he?" Derek demanded, his voice trembling. He spun back around to face the empty hospital bed, his hands gripping the crisp white sheets as if he expected to find me hiding underneath the mattress. I sat perfectly still in the cramped security monitoring room, watching the high-definition video feed as panic began to fracture their arrogant composure. Natalie rushed over to the bedside call button, her manicured fingers pressing it repeatedly. "This makes absolutely no sense," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch as fear finally pierced her armor. "He called me just yesterday. He was dying. The paramedics said they were bringing him directly to this exact room." Dr. Evans took a cautious step backward toward the wooden door, his grip tightening nervously on the handle of his leather briefcase. "This is not right," the fake notary muttered, his eyes darting toward the hallway. "If the patient is not here, I am leaving immediately. I am not getting involved in a missing persons case." Before the scam artist could even turn the brass doorknob, the door swung inward. A senior floor nurse stepped into the private suite. She was a tall, stern woman with decades of clinical experience, briefed by Detective Harrison on exactly how to handle this interaction. Her face was devoid of any warmth or bedside manner. She did not carry a chart, a stethoscope, or a tray of morning medications. Instead, she held a thick manila envelope against her chest. Natalie lunged forward, her high heels clicking against the linoleum floor. "Where is my father?" she demanded loudly, pointing a trembling finger at the empty hospital bed. "We are here to finalize his emergency directives today. You need to tell us exactly where you moved him." The stern nurse did not flinch. She did not offer an apology or a medical explanation. She simply looked at my daughter with an expression of freezing contempt. She held out the manila envelope. "Mr. Gallagher was discharged from our facility 3 days ago," the nurse stated, her voice as hard and cold as solid ice. "He is no longer a patient at this hospital. He specifically requested that I hand this directly to you when you arrived." Natalie snatched the envelope from the nurse's hand with force. The nurse did not say another word to them. She simply turned around and walked out of the room, letting the wooden door click shut behind her. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Derek rushed over to his wife's side, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Open it," he hissed urgently, his eyes wide with a desperate panic. "Open it right now." Natalie ripped the top of the envelope open, her hands shaking so violently she nearly tore the thick papers hidden inside. She pulled out a stack of legal documents bound by a blue clip. The bold header printed across the very first page was clearly visible on our security monitors. It read, "Irrevocable Charitable Trust Agreement." Benjamin Ross had done his job flawlessly. As Natalie rapidly scanned the legal jargon, the little color remaining in her face drained away, leaving her looking pale and profoundly sickly. "What is it?" Derek demanded, grabbing her shoulder roughly. "What does it say?" "It is gone," Natalie whispered, her voice hollow and defeated. "The house is completely gone, Derek. He transferred the deed into a charitable trust yesterday afternoon. The property belongs to a foundation now. He disinherited me. I get nothing. Not the house, not the bank accounts, nothing at all." Derek let out a choked, desperate sound, a noise that belonged to a broken man watching his life burn to ash. He snatched the packet out of her trembling hands, frantically flipping through the pages, searching desperately for a loophole that did not exist. But as he ripped through the documents, something else slipped out from the center of the envelope and fluttered down onto the hospital bed. It was a set of 3 glossy printed photographs. Natalie slowly reached down with a shaking hand and picked up the top photo. I watched the security monitor closely as her eyes locked onto the image. It was a clear night vision capture from my hidden garage camera. It vividly showed Derek dressed in dark clothes sliding underneath the front chassis of my parked vehicle, gripping my heavy-duty wire cutters in his right hand. The second photograph was a close-up shot of his face as he rolled out from under the car. The third photograph showed the severed hydraulic brake line taken by the police at the scrapyard. The evidence was absolutely undeniable. The shift from financial ruin to absolute unadulterated criminal terror was instantaneous and devastating. The forged documents and the stolen deposit money suddenly did not matter anymore. Derek dropped the irrevocable trust papers completely onto the polished floor. He stared blankly at the photographs, trembling in his wife's hands. His knees gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor of the hospital room, letting out a ragged, miserable sob. Dr. Evans pressed his back flat against the wall, his fake professional confidence entirely shattered, as he realized he was trapped in a room with a documented attempted murderer. But the envelope was not empty yet. There was one more thing waiting. Natalie reached inside one final time, her fingers pulling out a single white sheet of personalized stationery. I had written the short note myself late last night, using a steady, deliberate hand despite the pain. Natalie stared at the handwritten words, her lips trembling uncontrollably as she read my final, unforgiving message aloud in a broken, terrified whisper. I am not clueless. I was just heartbroken. The troublesome old man will let the police trouble you now. The trap was finally sprung. The psychological knockout punch landed with absolute uncompromising perfection. Their arrogant world was completely over. It was the perfect and final end to their dark lies. Dr. Evans scrambled toward the exit, his fake medical demeanor entirely stripped away by the instinct of a terrified, cornered rat. He reached a trembling hand toward the brass doorknob, absolutely desperate to escape the collapsing building of their criminal conspiracy. But before his sweaty fingers could even graze the metal, the heavy wooden door was violently pushed open from the outside. It swung inward with massive force, slamming against the plaster wall with a sharp, heavy crack that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet, sterile hospital room. Detective Harrison strode into the private suite, his broad shoulders squared, and his presence filling the confined space with absolute, uncompromising authority. He was immediately followed by 3 uniformed police officers, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts, ready for immediate action. Benjamin Ross stepped into the room right behind them, entering with the cold, calculated grace of a legal executioner. I watched the live video feed from the cramped security room down the hall, leaning forward in my metal folding chair, my heart beating with the steady, powerful rhythm of pure, unadulterated justice. The atmosphere in the hospital room instantly dropped to freezing. "Derek, you are under arrest for attempted murder in the first degree," the detective announced, the severe words striking the son-in-law like heavy physical blows. "You are also being charged with conspiracy to commit felony fraud, elder abuse, and the malicious destruction of a motor vehicle. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it immediately because we have everything we need on tape." The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Derek's wrists was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Dr. Evans backed away into the far corner of the room, raising his hands in a frantic, pathetic gesture of surrender. His battered leather briefcase slipped entirely from his grasp and hit the floor. The latch popped open, spilling the newly forged, durable power of attorney documents and the fake state notary stamps directly onto the hospital tiles for the police to clearly see. "I am just an independent consultant," the fake doctor babbled rapidly, his voice pitching upward in absolute terror. "I was just hired for a simple administrative job. I do not know anything about a car crash. I swear on my life I had absolutely nothing to do with any murder plot." Another uniformed officer stepped forward, grabbing the scam artist firmly by his cheap gray suit jacket and shoving his arms behind his back. "You can explain your specific consulting rates to the federal judge," the officer stated coldly, aggressively securing the second pair of handcuffs. "You are under arrest for impersonating a state medical official, forging legal documents, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." Then the focus of the entire room shifted entirely to Natalie. My daughter was standing completely frozen in the center of the suite, the warm color entirely drained from her perfectly manicured face. As the brutal reality of the situation finally breached her towering walls of lifelong entitlement, her fake, carefully curated composure completely disintegrated into dust. She looked at her husband, who was sobbing openly and pathetically against the wall, and then she looked at the grim faces of the police officers advancing toward her. She threw her trembling hands up in the air, her face twisting into a hideous mask of desperate performative victimhood. "Wait, please wait!" she cried out, tears instantly streaming down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. "You cannot arrest me. I am his daughter. I did not know anything about the car. I swear to God I did not know Derek was going to cut the brakes. He told me it was just an accident. I am a victim here too. He lied to me." She was actively throwing the man she supposedly loved directly under the bus, the very second her own luxurious freedom was threatened. It was a vile, disgusting display of ultimate self-preservation, completely devoid of any loyalty, love, or basic human honor. Benjamin Ross stepped forward, stooping down to pick up the discarded forged power of attorney from the floor. He looked at Natalie with a mixture of profound pity and absolute icy disgust. "You are not a victim, Natalie," Benjamin said, his sharp legal voice cutting right through her hysterical, echoing sobs. "We have the banking records. We have the offshore wire transfers. We know exactly where the stolen deposit money for your father's house went. You used a stolen credit card to hire a corrupt lawyer while your father was bleeding in the emergency room. You actively conspired to have him declared mentally incompetent. You may not have held the heavy wire cutters in the garage that night, but you eagerly set the stage and you were more than happy to step over his dead body to pay for your luxury designer clothes." Detective Harrison nodded firmly to the female officer standing by the heavy wooden door. "Book her for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and accessory after the fact." To attempted murder, the detective ordered without a single ounce of hesitation. The female officer stepped forward and grabbed Natalie's wrists. Natalie screamed a loud, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated entitlement being violently ripped away from her soul. She thrashed and kicked against the officer, demanding to speak to a lawyer, demanding to call her father, begging me to somehow hear her and save her from the consequences of her own evil actions one last time. But I was not going to save her. I sat quietly in the dark security room, watching the glowing monitors with cold, unblinking eyes as the solid steel cuffs snapped tightly shut around her wrists. I did not feel a single ounce of forgiveness. I did not feel any lingering regret. They marched the three of them out of the hospital room in a single, utterly humiliating line. Derek was weeping loudly, like a broken child. Dr. Evans was hanging his head in profound shame, and Natalie was screaming my name in terror, her desperate voice echoing down the sterile hospital corridor until the heavy steel elevator doors finally slid shut and swallowed them whole. The trap had closed perfectly. The toxic poison had been completely extracted from my life forever. And for the very first time since the horrible crash, I closed my eyes and took a deep, genuinely peaceful breath. The heavy chains of my blind, foolish parental love were finally broken, and true justice had been brutally, beautifully served. It has been 14 months since that freezing morning in the Seattle hospital. Today, the only ice I see is gently clinking against the glass of sweet tea I am holding in my hand. I am sitting on the balcony of a beautiful, modest condominium overlooking the bright blue waters of the Gulf of Mexico in Naples, Florida. The warm, salty breeze washes over my face, carrying with it the sound of seagulls and the gentle, rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the white, sandy beach below. The dark, relentless rain of Washington State feels like a lifetime ago. It feels like it belonged to a completely different man. In many ways it did. The man I used to be died in that mangled car at the bottom of a muddy ravine. The man I am today survived, rebuilt his foundation, and finally found peace. The legal aftermath of their arrests was swift and entirely unmerciful. When faced with the undeniable high-definition video of his actions in my garage, Derek completely broke down. He accepted a plea deal to avoid a lengthy public trial, confessing to everything. The judge handed him a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for attempted murder and felony fraud. He will spend the best years of his life locked inside a tiny concrete cell, completely stripped of his designer suits and his arrogant pride. Dr. Evans, the pathetic scam artist, received 5 years for his role in the forgery and conspiracy. And then there was Natalie, my own flesh and blood. She fought the charges tooth and nail. She hired an expensive defense attorney, using the last of her maxed-out credit cards, desperately trying to paint herself as a clueless, manipulated housewife. But the jury saw right through her perfectly applied makeup and her fake rehearsed tears. They saw the timestamps of her designer purchases, made with stolen money, while I was lying in a hospital bed. She was sentenced to 7 years in a federal women's correctional facility. The last time I saw her was in the courtroom on the day of her sentencing. She looked back at me from the defendant's table, her eyes begging for me to stand up and save her one final time. I simply looked back at her with absolute silence. I did not shed a single tear. The pain of cutting off a toxic family member is a very specific, suffocating kind of grief. It is profoundly different from the grief I felt when I lost my beautiful wife to cancer. When Carolyn died, I mourned the loss of a wonderful, loving presence. But when I had to lock my own daughter away, I was forced to mourn the horrifying realization that the person I loved actually never existed at all. It is incredibly difficult to accept that the child you raised, the baby you rocked to sleep, grew into a monster willing to step over your corpse for a payout. I spent many long nights sitting alone in the dark, wrestling with a heavy, bitter guilt. I questioned every single parenting decision I ever made. I wondered if I had completely ruined her character by giving her too much, by shielding her from the harsh realities of the world, and by bailing her out of every financial mistake she ever made. But eventually, the analytical mind of the engineer took over. I realized that while I may have built the scaffolding of her entitlement, Natalie was a grown woman who made her own deliberate, calculated choices. She chose to lie. She chose to steal. She chose to let her husband crawl under my car with wire cutters. At a certain point, blood simply ceases to be a valid excuse for absolute evil. You cannot continually set yourself on fire just to keep your abusive family members warm. As for the house, Benjamin Ross finalized the irrevocable charitable trust exactly as planned. My beautiful $1.8 million property was sold to a wonderful young family who will fill those empty rooms with new life and genuine laughter. The proceeds from the sale were entirely transferred into an educational foundation designed to help underprivileged youth attend engineering school. Carolyn would have loved that. I used a small portion of my own retirement savings to buy this little piece of paradise down here in Florida. I do not need a sprawling mansion to be happy. I just need safety, dignity, and the absolute freedom to live out my remaining years without constantly looking over my shoulder. The terrible burden of their greed has been completely lifted from my chest. I sleep deeply through the night now. I wake up every morning with a profound sense of gratitude. I survived a violent car crash. I survived a ruthless betrayal, and I survived the utter destruction of my own family tree. I tore down the rotten structure of my past and built something entirely new, smaller, but infinitely stronger. Sometimes the absolute greatest act of love you can perform is having the immense courage to say no. Sometimes protecting your own peace requires you to walk away from the people who share your last name. It is a terrifying, heartbreaking journey, but the peace you find on the other side is worth every single tear. I am Victor Gallagher. I am 76 years old, and I am truly alive. Thank you for listening. What would you do in my shoes? Would you send your own daughter to prison? Let me know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible life stories. Share this video with anyone struggling with toxic family members to show them they are not alone. Stay strong, protect your foundation, and I will see you in the next video.